Good afternoon, everybody. I am happy to join y'all virtually today to do this presentation for you. I think we will probably save questions to the end. So if you have questions as I'm going through the presentation, please go ahead and add those to the chat, and we will address as many of those as we can with the time we have at the end. And you will have my contact information, so if there are questions after the fact, you can feel free to reach out to me, okay? So again, I am Chris Pritchard, so I am the Programs and Trainings Coordinator for Prevent Child Abuse Kentucky. In case some of you don't know or haven't heard of Prevent Child Abuse Kentucky, we are a statewide nonprofit agency whose mission is to prevent the abuse and neglect of children throughout the Commonwealth through advocacy, awareness, education, and trainings like this one. We have over 300 partners across the state to help prevent child abuse and neglect before it starts. And it involves all kinds of different community members, whether it be business owners or school personnel, lots of youth service centers or libraries. So our partner network is pretty big and continues to grow almost on a weekly basis. So today, this is what we hope to get out of this presentation. So hopefully after this presentation, you'll be able to define child abuse and neglect according to our state law. You'll be able to identify the entities who assess and investigate child abuse and neglect, understand the obligation for reporting child abuse and neglect, and know the importance of how you make those reports and relaying the details to authorities when that needs to happen. I will also mention here that if it is not obvious yet, we are going to be talking about things like abuse and neglect. That can sometimes be triggering for folks. So we always like to point out the crisis hotline, the 988 hotline. But also, if this feels a little overwhelming, feel free to kind of step away from the presentation for a minute if you need to and come back. But we always like to kind of give a heads up on that. So we'll begin by talking a little bit about kind of the statistics. We don't spend a whole lot of time on statistics because what we have found through reporting is that often when we talk about how big the problem of abuse and neglect is, people feel as though the problem is too big to be solved. And that is certainly not the approach that we take, but we will look at a few of the numbers to begin with. So when families are strengthened and all adults take responsibility for protecting children, 22,500 occurrences of maltreatment could be prevented each year in our state. So you've probably heard the old adage, it takes a village. Well, it really does. And this is kind of a good example of that. Half of the cases that come to the attention of Child Protective Services are for ages 0 to 5. That does not mean that that children in other age ranges cannot be victims. It is important to note that ages 6 up to 18 can also be victims of abuse, and sometimes are often overlooked because of their age. But the ones that tend to come to attention the most are for children ages 0 to 5. Neglect is the highest form of abuse or neglect. It averages about 75% of substantiations across the nation and in our state. So these are the top 3 child maltreatment risk factors present in cases that are substantiated. So often one of these 3 things, and sometimes all 3 factors, are in place when abuse or neglect is happening. We know that in our state in particular, substance use disorder is a major issue that we are currently battling. Family violence is often one of the risk factors, and then undiagnosed or untreated mental health problems. And again, lots of times in cases we'll see all 3 of these major risk factors. So what does an abuser look like? Who do we think of when we think of someone who might commit child abuse? So often the media, if you kind of look at TVs and movies that are popular, you might think that a child abuser might look like one of the people here on the screen, a Hannibal Lecter kind of type. But that's just not the case, typically. Individuals who abuse or neglect children look like everybody else. Most parents that hurt their children are doing their best in tough circumstances, whether that be any number of things. So if you think about those 3 risk factors, maybe it's undiagnosed mental health issues, substance use, but parents are typically trying to do the best that they can for their children through those kinds of circumstances. Maltreatment, abuse, neglect does cross all economic, racial, ethnic, religious boundaries, sexualities. It is a myth that abuse is more likely to occur with a particular race or a particular ethnic group. We can't really talk about abuse and neglect without mentioning implicit bias. So if you've not heard of it, implicit bias is a form of bias that occurs automatically and unintentionally, but still kind of affects our judgments, decisions, and behaviors. Research tells us that individuals tend to form their own opinions or assumptions about families based on implicit bias. And implicit bias plays a big role sometimes in who we suspect might be victims of child abuse or neglect, or who might be perpetrators of maltreatment. And we see this in kind of 2 areas pretty often. First, families living below the poverty level are 3 times more likely to be substantiated for child maltreatment. Very often community members see a child or a family who is in need, and that family might be living in poverty. They may not have, adequate food or clothing. And maybe a neighbor or other caring individual who means well are uncertain how to help that family and may misinterpret the situation as neglect. And so they may not know what to do, and so often they will reach out to Child Protective Services and file a report of neglect, when maybe in fact that family just needs to be connected with community resources that can help them meet their family's needs. The second place we see this is when it comes to race and ethnicity. 53% of all Black children will experience a child abuse investigation before the age of 18. Data tells us that Caucasian, two-parent, and middle-class families are actually the most overlooked when it comes to physical abuse. It's also important to note here that everyone has unintentional bias. Sometimes unintentional bias may even go against our beliefs or our values. The environment and the world around us kind of cause us to form these assumptions about people or situations. They develop early and can often be influenced by parents or the media, different culture. And we also know that individuals, because of this, typically gravitate or favor individuals that look most similar to themselves, which might be or is one of the reasons Black children are often reported for abuse and investigated. So PCAK, Prevent Child Abuse Kentucky, we shorten it to PCAK quite often. We are in the business of primary prevention. So we spend a lot of our time looking at the root causes that set situations up for child abuse and look for ways that we can prevent child abuse through meeting some of these needs. In order for all community members to help prevent abuse and neglect, we kind of have to have an understanding of these root causes. Neglect and abuse is most often occurring in families who are under stress or who lack basic needs, don't have great social connections or support. And often it's parents who just don't have the information they need to be parents to children. You often hear folks say that children don't come with an instruction manual, neither does parenting quite often. And so often it's just a case of needing the correct resources. While we will talk about how to recognize different kinds of abuse and neglect, we really have to consider the role that we all play to help strengthen families when they're faced with difficult circumstances. Families have the ability to thrive if they have the right resources and connections. So if you kind of look at our graphic, it hits some of those major risk factors like untreated and undiagnosed mental illness, substance use. We talked a little bit about lack of resources, connection, job loss is a big stressor, some of those different things. And I'm sure there are others that you could think of that could kind of fit under that umbrella. So we'll begin by talking about kind of what physical abuse looks like and kind of what some of the red flags or clues are that abuse might be happening. So physical abuse can be committed by a parent, guardian, or a caretaker, anyone who is exercising control or in a supervision capacity at the time of the occurrence of abuse. By definition, physical abuse is not an accident. However, there are times, like in cases of intimate partner violence, where it is not the intent of the adult to injure the child, but the child maybe gets injured. Physical abuse can also result from over-discipline or over-punishment that is inappropriate to the child's age or condition. And what I mean by condition, we see abuse among lots of kids who are who have different special needs, whether that be physical or learning disabilities, that kind of thing. So some indicators that could be physical abuse. The first bullet here is one of those that if you see it, there's a very high likelihood that some kind of abuse has typically happened. So any kind of bruise or fracture on a children that is less than 1 year of age, or a child who is not mobile. Children who are not mobile typically do not get in situations where they are going to get bruised because they're not moving around on their own. So that is a big red flag, particularly for children who are not walking or crawling. Various wounds in different stages of healing, unusual or unexplained head injuries. We won't talk about it in this presentation, but we have another presentation on abusive head trauma in children. And so this is one of those that is often an indicator of that. Unusual bruises or burns, bite marks, scratches, any of those things can be indicators. Missing or loosened teeth, that is not, that's not in children who are at such an age where they're losing baby teeth. And then patterned injuries. So you often see these in abuse cases. So if you think of an extension cord and the mark that might make on someone, if they were hit with that, that's what we mean by a patterned injury. And then if there are repeat injuries, that may also be a red flag that would indicate potential abuse. There are also behavioral indicators of abuse. So a child might be unusually fearful or timid. So in ways that are kind of outside of the personality of the child. They might appear to be under a lot or more stress. They might have psychosomatic complaints, so they might complain of things like stomach aches a lot when there doesn't seem to be a physical reason for them to feel that way. Physical and language development delays. A child may crave affection, and that is kind of over and beyond what is typical for the child and their age. They may become afraid of physical contact. They may be overly anxious to please adults. They might be destructive or aggressive. They might have kind of indiscriminate attachment to strangers, so folks outside of kind of the family circle. And they may have a short attention span. Now, it is important to note that this list of indicators is, one, not all-inclusive, and the presence of one of these indicators listed does not necessarily mean a child is being abused or neglected. These are just clues that can often help you identify the needs of children and their families. So we'll talk next a little bit about child sexual abuse. So sexual abuse is defined as contact or interaction where a child or youth is being used for the sexual gratification of an adult or other perpetrator. It may be committed by another child or youth when they're in a position of power or control over the victim, or if they are significantly older. 40% of child sexual abuse cases are actually perpetrated by youth. And that's important to think about, particularly for different youth serving organizations. You know, I have a background in education, and so I often helped with different programs where high school students might be brought in to help supervise elementary school students, which there's nothing wrong with that. But when you think about this statistic, that 40% of child sexual abuse cases are perpetrated by youth, you then have to think about kind of what the policy is for that organization, and how do you vet volunteers and that kind of thing. We often think more about that with adults than maybe we do with older adolescents. Sexual abuse can be committed in lots of different ways. So some examples of that abuse: genital exposure, fondling, masturbation of the victim, oral sex, penetration. That also, though, includes photography of the child or exposure to pornography. And you'll see in our graphic here, 90% of child sexual abuse victims know who their abuser is. And so this kind of moves us away. You've probably heard the term stranger danger. This kind of moves us away from thinking about abusers in that way, since 90% of victims know who their abuser is. So we're not necessarily watching out for the guy in the white van, you know, walking on the sidewalk or playing on the sidewalk. That's almost never how it happens. It's also important here to understand that sexual abuse should not be put into different levels of severity. So a child who's experienced, for example, being fondled may have just as much trauma from that abuse who has experienced some kind of sexual penetration. So there are no levels. One is not, you know, less bad than the other. All children who experience this kind of abuse and any non-offending caregivers or family members should also be provided support once it is reported. Often the caregivers who, when a caregiver is responsible, caregivers who are not responsible and family members in the home are often not considered in the treatment and follow-up after the fact. So it's important to note that they are also important in these cases. So a few more facts here, and this is specifically on sexual abuse. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 13 boys experience child sexual abuse before their 18th birthday. As someone who has worked with students in the past, I can tell you the first time that I saw this specific statistic, I was really kind of floored because I primarily worked with middle and high school students. And so to be in a room of students and think about 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 13 boys, to think that probably somebody in a room where I have worked with students has experienced this is a kind of was jarring for me. Children ages 7 through 13 are the most vulnerable to child sexual abuse. 90% of victims and their families know the perpetrator. We already talked about that. And then an estimated 60% of sexual abuse victims never disclose their abuse. And it is probably certainly higher than that. That is an estimate. So thinking about the age range of children 7 to 13 and them being most vulnerable, some reasons for that are many children at that age range are beginning to kind of explore the world through activities outside of the home. So they're extracurricular activities after school. They're at school, they're at play dates or sleepovers. So they're going to have more freedom, which means they're going to be exposed to more adults and youth than they were at the younger ages. And so that increases opportunities for sexual abuse to occur. It's also important to know that those activities and opportunities are critical to the development and well-being of youth. So there's not a reason to not allow youth to participate in some of those activities. In fact, you should never discourage youth from participating in activities, but as adults and community members, we really have to work to ensure that organizations and other members of the community abide by policies and practice that are aimed at lessening the risk of child abuse when children are in their care. So you think about what are the policies around supervision for different programs or activities? What are the policies for transporting children in vehicles and those kinds of things? So some warning signs for sexual abuse. And again, these signs are not always necessarily, one of them on its own may not, for bruising, for example, may not mean that sexual abuse has occurred, but these are some of the most common ones as far as physical signs. Bruising, bleeding, redness around the mouth, the genitals or the anus, UTIs or sexually transmitted infections, pregnancy, it's a pretty obvious one. And then often child sexual abuse victims will exhibit kind of indirect physical signs like increased anxiety, chronic stomach pain, or headaches. Only about 4% of the time is there any physical evidence that sexual abuse has occurred. So it is unfortunately uncommon to be able to identify sexual abuse, typically through these physical signs. It is more likely that community members or family will pick up on behavioral warning signs than physical signs. Any extreme change in the behavior of a child signals the need to find out more about what is going on in the child's life. So there might be other stressful but not abusive situations that could be causing some of these concerns, but any of these signs are certainly reason to take a closer look at what might be going on. However, some victims may not display any behavioral problems or immediate symptoms in response to abuse. And then some of them might show very immediate and kind of profound behavioral indicators too. So again, these are just kind of clues that point out that you may need to take a closer look at what's going on. So some of the signs: trauma responses, And trauma responses can include things like nightmares, bedwetting, falling grades, cruelty to animals, bullying, being bullied, fire setting, runaway, self-harm, and you know, some other signs as well. You might also see changes in sleeping or eating habits, use of alcohol or drugs at a very early age. Children may have too perfect behavior, kind of outside of their typical behavior, wanting to please adults. They may entice other children into sexual kinds of play or act out sexual behaviors with dolls and toys. They may have age-inappropriate knowledge of sex or age-inappropriate knowledge. Every child will have a different response. If a child does display some of this behavior, like sexual acts of sexual behavior with dolls, or knowledge of sex that is not age appropriate, the important question to ask is, how does this child know about this? For some additional guidance on healthy stages of child sexual development and more on preventing child sexual abuse, so the QR code in this slide will take you to a separate child sexual abuse training that we have called Are They Good for Your Kids? Really, really great training. We have some great resources on that website that I would encourage you to take a look at. And I'll try to mention that again later as we get closer to the end of our slides here. So we will talk about neglect next. So an abused or neglected child means a child whose health or welfare is harmed or threatened with harm when the adult or caregiver does not provide the child with adequate care, supervision, food, clothing, shelter, education, or Medicare necessary for the child's well-being when they are financially able to do so or offered financial or other means to do so. So a few years ago, the state kind of updated the language for this so that we could make a determination between poverty and neglect. So a family who is doing their best with what they have to take care of their children is not necessarily neglect when they are not able to provide some of these resources to their family. So we have various forms of neglect. There's medical neglect, and that can include dental and mental health, exploitation, abandonment of children, a lack of supervision. There might be hygiene issues, lack of food or nutrition, education, any of those kind of major needs that we all have, clothing, substance use, domestic violence, or it might also be environmental neglect, which we'll take a closer look at. So this is a good example of environmental neglect. And we like to kind of use this picture because in the case of poverty versus neglect, a neighbor may say, well, their house really isn't clean. But is the state of their home because they don't have the resources to kind of keep up the house, or is it a real case of environmental neglect that maybe looks something like this picture? And of course, you can see kind of all of the dangers to a child in these pictures. You know, you can see rotting food, and you can think about what a child would have to navigate around in this picture. So some tips or warning signs to help us recognize neglect. Some of the behavior warning signs could be that they have severe developmental lags. Neglected children may often beg for or steal food. They may have an inappropriate seeking of affection or attention. They might be chronically dirty and not bathed, and I think that is the one that most folks think about when they think about neglect. They may have constant fatigue or listlessness, and they may be assuming adult responsibilities that is beyond their age and ability. So there's a lot of emotional injury that goes with child neglect. And that is an injury to the mental or psychological capacity or emotional stability of a child. And it's evidenced by observable impairments and their ability to function within a normal range as testified to by a qualified mental health professional. And that's kind of the kind of law's approach to emotional injury. This is one of the least substantiated forms of maltreatment in Kentucky and in the nation. One reason for that is that most laws require mental health professionals with specific degrees, experience, or licensing to attest to the behavior, making it more difficult to substantiate. And there are not a whole lot of great ways or well-validated ways to determine emotional abuse. But it is often observed through behavior, and it often accompanies physical abuse and sometimes sexual abuse. So some examples of that would be withdrawal of love, total rejection, isolating, ignoring, scapegoating, name calling, cruel or bizarre punishment, terrorization, or threats. It can also include excessive demands on a child's performance. So penalizing a child for positive, normal behavior such as smiling, discouraging a caregiver and infant attachment, penalizing a child for demonstrating signs of positive self-esteem, some of those kinds of things. In addition, kind of frequently exposing children to family violence and unwillingness or inability to provide affection or stimulation for the child in the course of daily care can also result in emotional abuse. So dependency is another form of neglect, and it's the last one we'll look at. Dependency is a form of neglect that is no fault of the parent or caregiver. It would be abuse or neglect if it were, but dependency is defined as a child other than an abused or neglected child that is under unintentionally improper care. So examples of this could be when a parent is physically ill and unable to care for children, or they are injured, or if a parent is suffering from some kind of mental illness, which has kind of incapacitated them from being a caregiver. And so it can also include children who are beyond control of the caregivers as well. So we'll kind of finish up the presentation here by talking through what making a report looks like. So it is important to note that in our state, anyone who knows or who has a reasonable cause to believe that a child under the age of 18 is dependent, abused, or neglected, they have to immediately make a report. So if you're asking the question, who is a mandated reporter, who is required to report, everyone in our state is a mandated reporter. This also applies to any suspicion of child trafficking. Any supervisor who receives a report from an employee of suspected neglect or abuse also is required to make a report. But it is important to note, reporting to a supervisor does not satisfy the legal obligation to report. And so if you are going to report a suspicion or knowledge of abuse, it is important, if you are the one who has that information, to make sure you follow through, even if you report it to a supervisor, that gets reported appropriately. So places you can report to: local law enforcement, Kentucky State Police, or the Cabinet for Health and Family Services. And so here's some kind of guidance on how to contact the cabinet if you want to make the report through them. So Monday through Friday, 8 to 4:30, outside of holidays, there's the statewide central intake hotline. And then there's a separate hotline for after hours, weekends, and holidays that is monitored. And then there is also a link where you can make reports online. I always like to note for folks, if you know for sure that abuse is taking place, definitely want to make a call rather than reporting online. Here's some of the information that you're probably going to need. They will want to know what has been seen or heard. They will want to know exact quotes. If the information has been relayed to you from a child, they're going to want to know the exact details, but it's also important not to add or take away parts that you feel aren't important. It's important to be objective. So you may have suspected for a while abuse in a family, for example, or a family may have a certain kind of reputation in your community, but it's very important when you're relaying this message to be objective and to provide as much information as possible. So if you know addresses, contact information, things like that, those are important things to pass along in a report. Here's some things that you might be asked as far as what has happened, the current location of the child, and any immediate safety concerns. You should not conduct your own investigation or interview. Leave that to professionals. Don't exaggerate emotions and try not to overreact. And if a child does disclose to you, let them know that they've done the right thing. Offer your support, and don't share the story with people who are not involved in the report. So this is, again, the hotline for reporting. After you make a report, Cabinet will determine what needs to happen. If someone is in immediate danger, they would typically send someone to investigate within 4 hours. If not, it's typically between 24 to 72 hours. Police may also investigate with DCBS as well. First priority is to protect the children. And if it is a case of child abuse or neglect where the child has to be removed from the home, the end goal is always to be able to offer that family support and reunite the family when possible. And I am kind of at the end of my slides here. If you take a look at this slide, if you scan this QR code, it will tell you about a movement in our state called Lean on Me Kentucky, which encourages a lot of the stuff I've talked about here, supporting families and helping provide resources to them before we get to a place of abuse or neglect. And our website can give you lots of other great information on that. So I'm going to stop here. And I will try to answer questions. I think we are over time, though. Is that correct?
We are over time, but thank you so much, Chris, for sharing all of this wonderful information. And I would encourage people to download a copy of the today's slide presentation, which is under PDFs and slides in your Blackboard Learn window. When you go out of this screen, you should see it at the bottom of the KYAC conference itself. But we thank you so much for all of the information as well. Chris's email address has been shared in the chat if you would like to take that down as well. We also want to thank LSTA and IMLS for sponsoring a portion of today's program and for providing support to KDLA. We thank you so much. We will have a break until 2 p.m. And please join us back in rooms 1, 2, or 3 for your next afternoon session.
Tricia, thank you so much.